acid is groovy. Kill the pigs. Those were the only words that a handsome young doctor said he heard one night in 1970, right before his wife and children were murdered. Was he the victim or the killer? That's the question at the center of the mind-bending true crime classic turned bedtime story, Fatal Vision. Good evening, and welcome to the first episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host and narrator, Nancy Miller. I'm a journalist, and you might know me from a few other true crime shows, but Dead Sleep is my passion project. Think of Dead Sleep like a cross between Dateline and David Lynch. Real-life mysteries told more mindfully. Stories that are gripping, but not too graphic. True crime classics transformed for nighttime listening. Dead Sleep is dark, and it's different, and it's not for everyone. But if you like to calm your overactive mind with a true crime story before bed, Dead Sleep is made for you. So with that, let's settle into bed. Close our eyes, get cozy under the covers, and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. In a story drawn from the mind-bending masterpiece by Joe McGinnis, Fatal Vision. Once upon a time, in a modest red brick house, lived the perfect family. Handsome 26-year-old Jeff McDonald, his beautiful wife Colette, and their two daughters, ages 2 and 5. Then, in the early hours of February 17th, 1970, what seemed like the perfect life was destroyed forever when 4 intruders broke into the McDonald home and violently attacked the McDonald family, going from room to room with a bat, a knife, and an ice pick. At least that's how Captain Jeff McDonald remembered the night of February 17th on an Army base in North Carolina known back then as Fort Bragg. Captain Jeff McDonald had moved with his family to Fort Bragg less than 6 months earlier as a member of the Green Berets. The Green Berets were known as the toughest special forces unit in the United States Army. But that night, when MPs found Captain Jeff, he was a shadow of himself. The Green Beret badass lay on the blood-stained floor of his living room, half naked and shivering next to the body of his wife, Colette. As medics treated him for what appeared to be severe injuries, they learned that Jeff McDonald wasn't your usual Green Beret. He was actually a physician who had recently moved with his family to work at the Army base's medical center. He'd been beaten and stabbed multiple times, he said. Jeff was rushed to the hospital where, fortunately, the doctor said his vitals were pretty normal. He did have a punctured lung, but it wasn't life-threatening. There were also lateral lacerations across his torso that might have come from a sharp knife or an ice pick, maybe even fingernails. There was a bruise on his forehead, but doctors told Jeff he was lucky. He didn't need surgery. He barely needed a Band-Aid. Mentally, though, Jeff was hysterical. In his hospital room, Jeff thrashed about his bed, barely making sense. Where was his wife? He yelled. Where were his 2 little girls? Tell him the truth. Were they dead? The hospital staff told Jeff his family was going to be fine. But that was a lie, told to Jeff so he'd calm down until he could be sedated. But within a few hours, Jeff, along with everyone else on the Army base and all over the country, would soon learn the truth. Jeff's wife, Colette, who was 5 months pregnant with their third child, didn't survive the attacks. Their 2 young daughters were also gone. Investigators assumed Jeff wasn't going to make it either. When they learned his injuries were superficial, they were surprised. Why did these intruders brutally kill a young mother and her 2 small children, not Jeff? The truth about what happened to them, how they were killed, why they were killed, and who killed them, the most basic facts around this triple homicide, would be argued, analyzed, and litigated hundreds of times by investigators, family members, lawyers, journalists, and the true crime obsessed for decades. Even now, over 40 years later, some believe the full story behind these murders has yet to be told. Back on that morning on February 17, 1970, investigators only had one version from their only surviving witness, Jeff McDonald. And his version of events went something like this. He'd spent the evening watching TV with his wife, then fell asleep on the couch. Then, out of the thick fog of slumber, he awoke to someone standing over him, attacking him with a wood club. Jeff also heard distant screams of his wife. As he sprang into action, he was stabbed and then hit again, this time in the head, so hard he fell to the ground, unconscious. When he came to, he said he frantically checked on his wife and kids. They didn't have pulses. He made it to the kitchen phone. There were only landlines back then, and he called for help. Then he collapsed next to his wife in the living room just before the military police arrived. Jeff said he remembered at some point his wife screaming, "Jeff, why are they doing this to me?" Investigators were eager to find that out too. Why would anyone do this? But first, they needed to find out who did this. Jeff shared bits and pieces from that night, flashes of faces and moments that, as the authorities cobbled it together, led to one name. A name that police knew. A name that everybody all over the world knew. Charles Manson. Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs. Those words were uttered by one of the intruders in the house. Words forever burned into Jeff's memory. Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs. Jeff described the 4 intruders in his house. Jeff said he didn't recognize their faces, didn't know who they were, but he did know all 4 of them were hippies. The unwashed, freaky, druggy, cultish hippies. Exactly like Charles Manson and the Manson family. He described the 4 intruders as 2 white males, one with long, scraggly brown hair, the other with a thick mustache. The third was a black male wearing an army jacket with sergeant stripes. And the 4th person was actually a woman. A young white female with very blonde hair, maybe a wig, wearing a floppy hat and white go-go boots. Jeff said she looked like a witch. He said he saw her face as she held a lit candle under her chin and said those strange words, like some kind of satanic incantation. Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs. The notorious Tate LaBianca murders had taken place in Los Angeles, California, just 6 months earlier. Those senseless killings, orchestrated by Charles Manson, were still fresh in people's minds. But nobody ever thought something like that could happen in North Carolina, on an army base. However, as criminal investigators walked through the McDonald house, trying to make sense of the scene, they couldn't help but notice one ominous detail that echoed the Manson family's MO. One of the intruders scrawled the word pig in huge letters on Jeff and Colette's wood bed frame in blood. By February of 1970, when the MacDonald murders took place, Manson and his followers were thousands of miles away in an LA County jail awaiting trial. Was this some grotesque tribute to Charles Manson? Nobody at Fort Bragg liked to talk about it, but there was a growing community of disaffected young people living together in shacks on the outer edge of the Army base in the nearby town of Fayetteville. Many of these outcasts were former soldiers who'd served in the Vietnam War. Young men, barely out of their teens, who'd returned from Vietnam physically, emotionally, and financially shattered. Some of them self-medicated with narcotics and hallucinogens, heroin, mescaline, and LSD. Young women, often runaways in their teens, found community in these enclaves, first dabbling with drugs, then slipping into addiction. Word soon spread about the MacDonald tragedy and the possibility that there was some Manson wannabe cult of homicidal hippies terrified the community. As authorities searched far and wide for those shadowy hippies, a trio of Army detectives from the Criminal Investigation Division, known as CID, zeroed in on the evidence found at the MacDonald house. Since the MacDonald family murders happened on Fort Bragg, the case fell under U.S. military jurisdiction, which meant these CID Army detectives were in charge. The chief detective was Franz Joseph Krebner, one of the CID's most experienced investigators. He arrived to the MacDonald house a few hours after MPs took Jeff to the medical center. Detective Krebner had been briefed by his team. What they knew so far was this: it was a home invasion. 6 adults, that's 4 intruders and Dr. and Mrs. MacDonald, in a violent struggle in a small 3-bedroom space. He expected busted furniture, bashed in walls. The detective had seen poker games and messier than this. His team examined the 3 potential weapons recovered at the scene: a 3-foot-long piece of wood, a paring knife, and an ice pick. Fatal wounds on the victims were likely the work of the ice pick, but when authorities found it, it'd been wiped clean, which just didn't fit the chaotic frenzy that Jeff had described. Same thing with the word pig written in blood in huge letters along Jeff and Colette's wood bed frame. Investigators believe the letters were scrawled by a right-handed person, but they didn't do it barehanded. Somewhere near the bed, investigators found torn pieces of a blue surgical glove. Whoever wrote pig first put on a surgical glove, then dipped their gloved finger into a pool of blood twice, then ripped off the glove in a hurry, inadvertently leaving little pieces of thin blue rubber behind. Remember, Jeff MacDonald was a doctor, so it made sense there were surgical gloves in the house, but they couldn't find any right away. Investigators searched every nook and cranny in the apartment until one determined investigator found a box of blue surgical gloves shoved way in the back of a kitchen cabinet. So they wondered, drugged out hippies kill a family, then find some surgical gloves way back in a kitchen cabinet, put a glove on to write in blood, then rip them off and flee the house. Detective Krebner also noticed what the hippies didn't do. Jeff was a doctor and had a closet filled with drugs, stuff for pain, and several bottles of an antipsychotic sedative called Thorazine. Drug addicts tended to tear into that kind of stuff, but not this time. Same with other valuables in the house. The china in the cabinets were all neatly stacked, no jewelry stolen. The only damage to the living room was a tipped-over coffee table, the edge of the heavy table resting awkwardly on a stack of magazines. The magazine at the top of the stack was the March 1970 issue of Esquire. The cover of the men's magazine was a black and white close-up of Oscar-winning actor Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin was known for playing tough guy roles. In the interview, Lee Marvin made a point of drinking beer for breakfast. Lee Marvin wasn't the kind that would take any shit from a bunch of hippies. And investigators couldn't help but wonder the same about Jeff McDonald. Jeff was a Green Beret, the toughest dudes in the Army. Looking at the crime scene, why didn't Jeff put up more of a fight? So Detective Grebner and his CID investigators believed, from day one, that Jeff did it. But this case was under U.S. military jurisdiction. Because of Vietnam, the public opinion of the U.S. military was abysmal. So they had to tread very carefully. Any missteps on a high-profile triple homicide would be disastrous. Already, the investigation had some embarrassing blunders. Dozens of people had come into the apartment, contaminating the crime scene. Somebody made off with Jeff's wallet. Someone took the McDonald's trash out, and the garbage trucks hauled it away before investigators could go through it. The blood-stained pajama bottoms Jeff wore that night, they were also gone. People used the McDonald's toilet, flushing hopes of finding anything like a torn glove right down the drain. And that's just a few mistakes. Detective Grebner worried about the circumstantial evidence they did have. The murder weapons, the piece of glove, the illogical crime scene. It just didn't seem like enough. For the U.S. military to formally charge Dr. Jeff McDonald with murder, what they really needed was for him to confess. To get him to do that, they needed to find something about him, about his past, about some secret life, something that would break him. And it wasn't going to be easy. Dr. Jeff McDonald was perfect. Green Beret captain, high school prom king, loyal husband to his childhood sweetheart, Ivy Leaguer, beloved physician at the medical center. In the weeks after the murders, everyone the investigators spoke with, they all loved Jeff. Then, they learned how women really loved Jeff. Jeff really loved women back. They met a nurse who confessed she had a fling with Dr. Jeff McDonald when they met during a Green Beret training event in Texas. She even shared a picture of herself in Jeff's hotel room, seated on his bed, wearing his Green Beret, and not much else. But it was just a fling. They didn't even sleep together. Just sweet nothings. But for the case, it was a big, juicy something. The first time they had a hint of a motive. Jeff liked to run around. His wife found out about it. Things got out of hand, horrifically out of hand. And Jeff invented this crazy hippie story as his cover. And it turned out it was literally a cover story. Remember that issue of Esquire they found in the McDonald house? The one with Lee Marvin on the cover? The issue had a theme, the art of evil. There was an article about Charles Manson and the Manson family ranch in Death Valley, but there was another article in that issue of Esquire that was more important. A close friend of Jeff's remembered being at the McDonald's house just a few days before the murders. While hanging out with Jeff and eating cookies and Jell-O, a friend remembered Jeff regaling him with this wild story about a woman in L.A. known as the Acid Goddess, a sexy witch who drank liquid LSD by the goblet and performed dark rituals in a room filled with candlelight. This Acid Goddess talked a lot about Sharon Tate's murder. There were photos of the Acid Goddess too. In 2 photos, the Acid Goddess wore a big, floppy hat. So that's where this ridiculous scenario came from. Jeff stole it from a magazine he'd read just a few days earlier. Investigators believed there were no intruders, no girl in a floppy hat, no cult. It was all BS. Now they just needed Jeff to do the right thing and confess. 6 weeks after the McDonald murders, Detective Grebner and his CID teams sat across Jeff for the first time. He'd come to the CID offices on his own. No lawyer. He was innocent, he said. He didn't need a lawyer. The investigators revealed what they'd found. Evidence of Jeff's infidelity with that nurse in Texas. How his version of events didn't add up. Was there something he wanted to get off his chest? They grilled him for hours. But he didn't break. He insisted he was innocent. Detective Grebner wanted more time with Jeff, at least one more interview, but his higher-ups said they couldn't afford to wait. They had to ease the public's mind that they had a suspect in custody. To say the Army rushed this announcement was an understatement. As Jeff remembered it, he found out he was the suspect in the murder of his own wife and children when he heard that announcement over the loudspeaker in a crowded cafeteria on the Army base. Jeff willingly and awkwardly turned himself in. A handsome 26-year-old Green Beret and military doctor being the alleged killer of his own family made national news. Dr. Jeff McDonald would go before a tribunal of officers who would decide if they'd move forward on his case. If the case moved forward and Jeff was found guilty of multiple murders, under military law, he'd be court-martialed. If they decided not to move forward, charges would be dropped and Jeff would walk free. In the summer of 1970, the U.S. Army's lawyers were busy building their case. This case wasn't a slam dunk, but prosecutors were optimistic. They could prove Jeff obviously lied about what happened that night, that his version of events was a complete work of fiction. Then, a bombshell. A woman. A hippie chick who practiced witchcraft, loved candles, and dropped acid. She owned a blonde wig, knee-high boots, and wore a floppy hat. So who was this strange woman? And how was she connected to these murders? Find out in the next episode of Dead Sleep. True crime for bedtime. Are you still awake? If so, subscribe now for bonus episodes. Until then, nighty-night. Don't let the serial killers bite.